The highly subjective character of myth might lead us to expect an irresolvable conflict with the claims and methods of science. After all, it's one of the foundational tenets of science that propositions be clear, unambiguous, evidence-based, and free from unacknowledged bias. Yet we find that science, the supposed bastion of the objective, actually has a close and complicated relationship to the subjective realm of the mythic. This is particularly evident when it comes to the public popularization of science. Consider a blockbuster nature documentary such as the BBC's Blue Planet. Note the extensive use of narrative, which often pushes to the fringes the kind of ordered accounts we expect from science proper. See how hypotheses and evidence take second place to dramatic and symbolic priorities. Observe how the camera work puts us in the midst of things, unable to gain the detached perspective science usually strives to attain. In recent science documentaries, technical details, locations, temperatures, depths, and so on, seem to fade to a distant significance. We no longer know or truly care whether we're watching a real habitat or an artful reconstruction. Are these polar bears in Greenland or a zoo in London? But who cares? They are simply bears as a symbol, and we identify with their struggle because we also struggle. Moreover, the phraseology of modern documentary voiceovers is dense with poetic connotations. As we descend in a submersible, we know nothing of precise depths and coordinates. We are merely at the bottom of the sea, at the end of the world. The images and subjects on the screen become a form of metaphor. The narrator embellishes the tales with anthropomorphizing language, using them as characters through whom we see ourselves reflected. These documentaries are stories, first and foremost, not ordered accounts of the facts. After all, facts can be alienating, but stories are universal, and it's foundational to the success of a story that we identify with the characters. The entire effect of the modern nature blockbuster is a far cry from the cool, objective stance we usually associate with science. Rather than a logical and balanced survey of relevant data, the intended effect appears instead to be to overwhelm us with crashing waves of awe. These documentaries are not so much designed to make us understand things, but rather to induce a quasi-religious wonder at the natural world. This is not science as hypothesis, experimentation, and induction. This is science as myth, as worship, as a form of spiritual communion with the natural world. Cosmologist Carl Sagan's statements are a case study in this kind of appeal to the mythic. Take the mysticism of his famous statement from the documentary series Cosmos. The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself. As a brilliant science popularizer, it's no accident that many of Sagan's pronouncements resonate with poetic power. The most canny scientific communicators have always understood the potent power of poetry and myth in advancing the popular appreciation of their disciplines. This makes abundant sense. Perhaps one person in a few thousand truly has a head for advanced levels of abstract proof or rigorous scientific induction. But as we have seen, the appeal of the mythic is near universal. To convince the masses of the appeal of science, why risk boring them with equations or inductive rigour? Simply tell them a captivating story. But this muddying of the waters between the objective and the mythic by scientists was not lost on C.S. Lewis. Living as he did through the 1930s, 40s and 50s, the so-called golden age of science fiction, he came to understand that much of the appeal of what he called the scientific outlook did not come from its rational content. After all, the appeal of science fiction does not rest on any authority of science or its results. Rather, science fiction operates as a form of technological myth. In great science fiction of print and screen, from H.G. Wells to Black Mirror, science and technology serve as characters and contexts in a deeper exploration of the human condition. Science is conscripted as actor and stage, not as a method but as a channel, not as a technique to derive objective truths, but as a conduit between the human condition and the imagination. In this sense, science fiction is classic myth-making, shining the light of our existential burdens through the lens of character and context to help us make sense of ourselves. This is why Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror, ostensibly a dystopian anthology series about our relationship to technology, ends up being far more about us than the technologies around which each scenario revolves. However, this close relationship between science and the mythic extends far beyond documentaries and sci-fi. As Lewis realised, the luminous power of the mythic was just as present in the official narrative which the scientists of his age were developing about life, the universe, and everything. A brief recounting of the scientific account of our origins reveals it to be freighted with great imaginative appeal. At the opening of this great epic, all matter, space, energy and time leapt forth from the infinite void by infinitesimally slender chance. Then, after countless millennia of celestial churning had calmed, on a small rock hanging weightless in the endless vacuum of space, vital life somehow sprang forth from inert matter. In a miracle of minute probability, the animate rose unbidden from the inanimate. Against all odds, life then complicated itself, rising from the single cell to the dragons, from the sludge to the dinosaurs of the Mesozoic age. Then came Proto-Man, naked and shivering against all the odds in a world of reptilian monsters, frozen wastes and vast danger. Gradually, inch by grueling inch, came Homo sapiens' mastery of the physical world. Through unimaginable struggle, man was formed, ascending step by painful step to the throne of nature. And out of the unremitting violence of prehistory, humanity learnt to attain wisdom and a measure of happiness in this cruel and cold universe of chance and entropy. It's an extraordinary narrative, and like all great myths, it's full of tension, twists and turns. But as Lewis noted, we must add the end of the story to find the narrative coup de grace, the mythic masterstroke. The denouement adds just enough bitter pathos to the tale to perfectly balance the sweetness of man's vanishingly improbable ascent from the primordial sludge to nature's throne. As Lewis writes, if the myth stopped at that point, the ascent of humanity, it would lack the highest grandeur of which human imagination is capable. The last scene reverses all. We have the twilight of the gods. All this time, silently, unceasingly, out of all reach of human power, nature, the old enemy, has been steadily gnawing away. The sun will cool, all suns will cool, the whole universe will run down. Life, every form of life, will be banished without hope of return from every inch of infinite space. All ends in nothingness, and universal darkness covers all. The pattern of myth thus becomes one of the noblest we can conceive. It is the pattern of many Elizabethan tragedies, where the protagonist's career can be represented by a slowly ascending and then rapidly falling curve. You see him climbing up and up, then blazing in his bright meridian, then finally overwhelmed in ruin. Such a world drama appeals to every part of us. Lewis recognised that the finely poised tragedy of the finale lends exquisite poetic balance to the grand tale. Its mythic power satisfies the imagination at a profound level. But this is very, very different to the logical satisfaction of an elegant mathematical proof. What Lewis called the scientific outlook has all the qualities of a story people will want to believe because of its mythic, imaginative appeal, long before any supporting structure of evidence or reason is built underneath it. As in all myths, there is a walloping subjective power that exists whether or not there is any objective correspondence in the details. The tale has a beauty whether it is true or not, whether one believes it or not. As Lewis himself confessed of the scientific outlook, I, who believe less than half of what it tells me about the past, and less than nothing of what it tells me about the future, am deeply moved when I contemplate it. Importantly, this intermingling of the mythic does not prevent many of science's analytic and empirical claims being demonstrably true. Yet there is something curious about the union, since myths defy the very kind of rational inquiry upon which science is built. The mythic is a kind of subjective tumour in the crystalline objectivity of science, an uneasy bedfellow for a discipline which usually demands hard evidence and dispassionate logic as the price of admission for any so-called truth. And yet, on one level, this union is entirely understandable. Science is a potent generator of myth because, as we have seen, anything with true correspondence to reality is bound to appeal deeply to the imagination as well as to the reason. As Lewis himself memorably put it, man is a poetical animal and touches nothing which he does not adorn. No wonder Carl Sagan, David Attenborough, Stephen Hawking and all the other great science communicators cannot help breaking away from theory and fact into poetic doxology, outbursts of praise at regular intervals. To cite Lewis again, all worldviews yield poetry to those who believe them by the mere fact of being believed. If the methods of science are consistently hitting coordinates of meaning in the fabric of reality, it is no surprise that the scientists involved, as human beings, find rich imaginative suggestiveness as well as rational facts when they break the ground. Yet understandable though this doxological prompting of the natural order is, there is an uneasy tension at play. Though we could imagine a kind of broad understanding of what science means, a classical scienter which harmonises insights from natural science, philosophy, theology and the arts, this is not what science is in our day. Though modern science was not birthed in radical skeptical materialism, that is where we have ended up. Though the first great scientists were also theologians, philosophers and poets, men of reason and imagination who embraced scienter, knowledge, wherever it may be found, science in our day has shrugged off everything except the narrowly rationalistic claim to meaning. And this means the foundational tenets of our modern brand of hard science cannot properly permit the kinds of subjective remainder of rationally unexaminable meaning characteristic of myth. To the extent that the gatekeepers of natural science demand that rationality alone shall lead the way to truth, the imaginative claim to meaning will always be a strange bedfellow to the methods and assumptions of rationalistic science. There is therefore a curious double standard, a hypocrisy even, in how much the popularization of science today does draw on the power of the mythic. On the one hand, some of rationalism's more hardline spokespeople demand that we reject anything we cannot demonstrate using reason alone. On the other hand, some of those same spokespeople unashamedly channel the inexplicable power of the mythic and poetic to supercharge their case for the widespread acceptance of scientism among non-scientists. This cognitive dissonance makes it important to divide the powerful effect of the myth from the objective claims of science proper. There is what appears to be an element of power play in some scientists' appeal to poetic power, particularly among those who simultaneously decry religion on the basis of its supposed subjectivity. Many advocates of secularism have ended up endorsing highly unscientific methods to plant a hardline rationalism in the minds of those who will never themselves be in a position to be able to critique scientific thinking and method from the inside. It is hard to see this as anything other than appeal to authority. You just enjoy the story, trust the clever people with the facts. At the limit, some scientists end up virtually asking us to worship science as a form of deity. Consider these musings of Caroline Porco, a planetary scientist and the team leader of the imaging team for the Cassini probe. The same spiritual fulfillment and connection usually found in religion can be found in the revelations of science. From energy to matter, from fundamental particles to DNA, from microbes to Homo sapiens, from the singularity of the Big Bang to the immensity of the universe, ours is the greatest story ever told. We scientists have the drama, the plot, the icons, the spectacles, the miracles, the magnificence and even the special effects. We inspire awe, we evoke wonder. And we don't have one God, we have many of them. We find gods in the nucleus of every atom, in the structure of space-time, in the counterintuitive mechanisms of electromagnetism. What richness, what consummate beauty! This is simply one symptom, among many, demonstrating a peculiar state of affairs in the popularization and communication of science. In the name of science, many of the aggressive nightclub bouncers of rationalism violently throw all traces of the religious, of myth, of connotations, subjectivism and the spiritual out of the front door of the human experience. but then appear to welcome those very same guests in again through the back door, simply wearing different clothes. We have seen how mythic themes recur across cultures and ages, and how the familiar tang of the mythic can be discerned even in the way science is carried out and communicated. There is something mysteriously universal to myth, to the way in which, across vast distances of time and space, the same foundational wellsprings of meaning are channeled forth through characters and narratives to quench the thirst of the imagination. Of the various mythic themes which recur repeatedly throughout human history, the dying deity is a particularly potent example. Refracted through the windows of different cultures and places, the animating force of this myth has been clothed in characters as diverse as Osiris of the Egyptians, Balder of the Norsemen, Izanami of the Japanese, Quetzalcoatl of the Mesoamericans, Tammuz of the Mesopotamians, Attis of the Phrygians, and Adonis and Dionysus of the Greeks. In other words, the dying god theme illustrates precisely the kind of imaginative recurrence which suggests that the same deep existential stream has been tapped in each case. C.S. Lewis spoke of the poetic pungency of this dying god myth in his own experience. Writing in Surprised by Joy, he recalls his first encounter with the Norse god Balder in these lines of Tegner's Norse ballad Drapa. I heard a voice that cried, Balder the beautiful is dead, and through the misty air passed like the mournful cry of sunward sailing cranes. I saw the pallid corpse of the dead sun borne through the northern sky. Blasts from Niflheim lifted the sheeted mists around him as he passed. Writing much later in his life, Lewis related being mysteriously moved by this account of Balder's fate. Never mind the ahistoricity of the dying god, no matter Balder's complete lack of correspondence to any actual time or place. There was nonetheless a great beauty and pathos to the tale, something about this fictional god which resonated deep in the imagination. It was not necessary to believe in Balder in order to feel this existential correspondence. It is irrelevant whether we could have touched or heard Balder had we been in the right place at the right time. The entire purpose of the myth is one of connotation, a fully bored appeal to the imagination, without asking us to believe or do anything in particular. Importantly, the response is left up to us. Andrew Fellows has pointed out this notable property of most myths. The vast majority are non-creedal. They lack any recognizable creed, any recognizable statement of faith. The kind of statement that begins, "we believe," is completely tangential to the content and purpose of almost every myth across every age. This is why, as Lewis himself observed, there is no identifiable theology accompanying the vast majority of myths. Greek religion, for example, was utterly mythological and yet virtually entirely untheological. As Lewis put it, there was no systematic series of statements which the Greeks agreed in believing about Zeus. And yet these myths still do something to people. They are tied up in how people think and behave. There is universality to their underlying meaning, both in the way that meaning is forced through again and again in the creative works of distinct cultures, and also in its rich imaginative appeal in the lives of those who encounter it. In common with the myth of the dying deity, all the great mythic themes seem to recur in this way. They each give voice to a universal well of meaning deep in the human condition, and as such they push through everywhere art and poetry have been made across human history. Imaginative expressions seem to cluster around certain aspects of our existence, like palms around an oasis. Whenever we find a high density of mythic recurrence around a particular theme, we have a clue that we have touched one of the more universal and mysterious aspects of our existence. Universal because the same theme has pushed forth again and again into the imaginations of diverse people in diverse places. And mysterious because it seems that in many instances only the subjective arts are able to give voice to this well of significance. This is the wager of the imaginative, that there is meaning and truth in Milton's Paradise Lost, in Dante's Inferno, and Shakespeare's Hamlet, even though that meaning and truth cannot be expressed in rational propositions. Myths may usually be untheological and clothed in fictitious forms, but this looseness and ahistoricity does not prevent them being powerfully suggestive prompts to human action. However, this is not the kind of action that is based on proposition. Unlike road signs, legal codes, or technical manuals, myths do not say, "do this," or "think that." Instead, because they appeal to the imagination rather than the analytic faculties, myths operate in a liturgical way to shape us. That is, they mould us subconsciously over repeat exposure, rather than objectively stating what we should believe or how we should act. They touch the heart and the emotions rather than the reason, en route to the centre of our decision-making faculties. They influence us, but the shape of our response is left open-ended. We could put the difference in this way. After reading a car repair manual, you know exactly what to do to repair the car. But after reading the Aeneid or watching King Lear, the way you carry its impact into your life is an open question. Because most myths combine a subjective lack of theology, combined with a potent appeal to the imagination, human responses to myths are generally unpredictable and unguided. Since there is no theological control to channel the effect of mythic themes on our actions, there is nothing to correct potentially destructive and morally abhorrent responses to their imaginative power. As a result, myths can go rogue, a truth that is borne out repeatedly in the history of human civilizations. One powerful locus of myths is the sensed reality of patterns of death and birth in reality, and specifically the sense that death is inextricably linked to new life. This sense probably flows in part from first-hand experience of nature, of seeds buried in the ground bringing forth new seedlings, of wild animals dying to defend their young, of livestock slain to feed and nourish human beings. And across numerous ages and cultures, different mythic expressions have clothed the powerful resonance of this theme in dramatic tales that are rich with symbolism and fictitious deities. In a sense, each of these mythic expressions represents an attempt to imaginatively work through, or read out, or exegete the powerful, felt significance of the theme in human experience. Over the ages, many of the mythic responses to the death-rebirth theme have been odd, but largely harmless. Consider, for example, the historic abundance of bizarre fertility rituals. However, at times, its evocative imaginative power has spawned some truly terrible, warped mythic expressions and responses. In various places throughout history, cults of human sacrifice, and child sacrifice in particular, have given barbaric imaginative expression to some of our darkest human intuitions about life and death. In these expressions, a fictitious god often acts as a terrible personalization of a felt need to engage with the birth-death dichotomy and to seek to control it for our own ends. This is a dark and twisted form of poetry. The sensed theme of death and birth is shaped into concrete imaginative expressions of often terrible cruelty. There is certainly mythic power to the idea of exquisitely costly sacrifice to secure blessing, but the concrete action to which it has driven people in many instances is reprehensible. Kronos of the Carthaginians, Moloch of the Canaanites, She of the Chimu may be fictitious deities, but the children sacrificed in their names were very real. In these cases, the lack of any objective theological control on the imaginative power of myth was an enabler of great wickedness. There was nothing rational to bound or to guide the way that powerfully sensed meanings were poetically acted out. It is therefore naive to assume that every imaginative expression that pours forth from our existential condition is pure and healthy. As we have seen, there can indeed be a certain demonic power to myths. Because a mythic expression is usually silent on a correct interpretation or action, there is nothing to guarantee that responses to its imaginative influence will not verge towards the violent and the sadistic. The gods of child sacrifice were not real, but these fictions nonetheless acted as loci through which potent mythic themes were refracted in terrible ways. This is always a risk to our human attempts to work out responses to our existential pressure in the realm of the imagination. The mythic can give powerful shape to our urges, for good and for ill, urges and intuitions which, unconstrained by the control of reason, can veer into either the ecstatic and the sublime, or the bizarre and sadistic.